I want to talk about the concept of impact and the unique way that the psychoanalyst Dr. Michael Eigen writes about it. The theme of impact contains or continues the concepts that we have treated so far. Without memory or desire, K and O, transformations in K and in O, the capacity to tolerate frustration, beta and alpha elements, alpha function, and the extension of it through the concept of dreaming. But before we talk about impact, it is important for me to introduce Dr. Eigen and his unique way of writing. For me, the way he writes is closely related to the field we are exploring, particularly to the concept of impact. Eigen is a psychoanalyst, a poet and a mystic. He was born in 1936 and lives in New York. He published more than 25 books and 100 articles and also edited the Psychoanalytic Review. He's extraordinarily knowledgeable in psychoanalytic theories, but the main writers who influenced him are Bion, Winnicott, and Lacan. For that class, I will mainly use his excellent book, Psychic Deadness. I often say or think that Eigen is a bit like an animal that has large sense ranges. That is, he has a level of sensitivity and giftedness to absorb, feel and describe extra delicate events at the level of energy flow that occurs in the therapist's room. He has a fabulous ability to describe these events in a way that constantly moves. His style is poetic and descriptive, trying to convey the actual experience in microscopic resolution, avoiding theoretical and diagnostic buzzwords. He writes in a very personal, sometimes even revealing way about the processes he goes through as a therapist. Eigen has brilliant quotes. For example, he writes, "Psychoanalysis is a form of prayer," or that aliveness threatens us may not be something we get over. He writes about machines. Machines deaden our need for help, human help. He writes that we created machines in the hope of de-animating ourselves. Maybe making life more mechanical would solve what we came to call irrationality, emotionality, and untamable disturbance. He has a lot of complaints about the mentality that tries to eliminate the fragile parts of ourselves. He writes, "Thinking you have to be healthy is one of the great diseases of our time." I really enjoy reading his quotes. He writes about dreams. We can't ignore the realness of what dreams convey and get away with it for long. There's a reality, a truth within dreams. You can't just cancel it out by simply saying it's not true. Another thing that he talks about has to do with damage. Eigen writes, "Psychological damage is an intrinsic part of every meaningful dyad. Damage is part of life processes, part of the way life works. We don't live in a damage-free world." We won't stay long with the theme of damage in Eigen's scriptures, but it does resonate with the Buddha's first noble truth that there is suffering in human existence. It's not a world without damage. Eigen sharpens existential insights very sensitively, and when he writes about damage, one can imagine he actually sees and describes the microscopic space where particles of one person's mind contact the particles of another person's mind. In this contact, there's nurturance, but simultaneously it contains damage. Dr. Aner Govrin, a psychoanalyst who interviewed Eigen, writes that at the beginning of the interviews with Eigen, he would stop him many times asking him, "What do you mean by this?" and would ask him to explain more, if he could repeat things. At first, Michael Eigen was polite and friendly and repeated things, but at one point he started to get annoyed and said, "Just listen instead of all the time asking and trying to sort things into the categories you already know." Dr. Govrin understood that the best way to listen to Eigen was to try to listen to him openly, in a meditative way. He also thinks it's the best way to read his books, that is, try to be impacted by them and allow the content and style of writing to impact you deeply and take you to associative places, and not so much insist on understanding in the intellectual sense or in the sense that categorizes the material. I want to present more quotes that other psychoanalysts wrote about Michael Eigen. For example, Dr. Meir Steinbuch wrote, "The initial and not the secondary unconscious processes are primarily those that, according to Eigen, are influenced by the therapeutic process. The quality of the unconscious process changes. In fact, something happens that is very difficult to define. What changes are the unconscious processes themselves in a manner which is unknowable." This quote will be very relevant when we deal with the concept of impact. What changes are the very unconscious processes in a way that is not possible to know, to identify, or to locate. Dr. Boaz Shalgi writes that Eigen represents a transition in the field of psychoanalysis from what can be called the linear method of aspiring to the circular method of moving in. He writes that in the psychoanalytic conception throughout the years, there has always been a there, a liberated there. I mean, when I get there, when I'm healthy, when I'm sufficiently processed, I'll feel good. It is then a theory, a linear method built on a hypothesis of progress that aspires along a certain line. A line that somewhere along its progression, the required experience is found. There. Any there, alleges Eigen, is an enslaving concept. Freedom is never a situation of aspiration towards something, but a situation of movement. A movement that finds and loses, arrives and is lost, undresses and dresses a form. Eigen reminds me a lot of the Israeli writer David Grossman, who is also emotionally gifted and has an exceptional ability to write initial internal events in a language that is simultaneously poetic and jargon. In a beautiful interview, Grossman talks about a book he wrote related to the tragedy that befell him and his family who lost their son. Grossman says, "The book comes as a response to a death event, which is the complete stop. One of the things that threatened me a lot in this situation is contact with a situation where there are no nuances, no breathing, no movement. That's why I understood from the beginning that I had to move, for two reasons. To try to insert movement at that stop, to that piece of cement, that something flutters in it, and also for me, since an event like this has the ability to kill not only the dead, but also those around them, or kill things in them. I couldn't accept that the person who writes in me is defeated," he explains, "as an internal protest or an internal rebellion. When I wrote about movement, I felt that I could be in the place that I choose, and not in the place where the tragedy tries to fixate me. It is the only freedom I have. In this situation, man does not have much freedom, and freedom is embodied in the possibility of describing the tragedy in your own words. Because in my words there is always movement, I felt that the moment I manage to generate movement within that absence, in a certain way I stop being the victim, which I was until the moment I start writing. Writing allows me to claim again my life that was somehow almost taken." Grossman wants to clarify that this is a clear act of choice in life. All my books were written from a feeling of suffocation, claustrophobia, but in this book, there was something else, something more existential, which for me is the absolute core of the work. It is a place where life and death touch each other without dividing, the place where we do not escape the horror of death, since being a living person means existing from the consciousness of death. This text describes in a very precise way the sensation that exists when reading Eigen. He addresses core situations that refer to psychic death, coercion, destruction, and tragedy, but he does so and remains there in a way that always contains movement. His way of describing always contains some movement, even in catastrophic situations, and he also has the ability to insert movement in those places. One of Eigen's quotes I like the most is on the subject of impact. He writes, "Self-to-self impact is the core clinical work." That is, the core of clinical work is the impact of one person on another person. And this theme of impact is the theme I'm going to develop throughout this class.